Well, it's certainly an honor to be introducing Eva Golinger tonight. Eva is a Venezuelan-American attorney, investigative journalist, and of course a best-selling author. And I think beyond that, it's probably safe to say that we have a revolutionary in the midst here this evening. And as you should know by now, part of the apparatus that the U.S. and indeed Canada, as President Chavez terms it, the North American Empire, goes by the Orwellian name of democracy promotion. In either of Eva's books, you will learn a great deal about this template of intervention and about nefarious agencies such as the National Endowment for Democracy, the International Republican Institute, and of course the CIA and others. With a colleague, as I mentioned, I was in Venezuela last December to cover the presidential elections and set about to look into some of the NGOs, the non-governmental agencies, to try and interview them about their purported democracy work on camera. Both the Canadian and U.S. embassies refused to discuss their democracy promotion activities with us. The U.S. justified this by saying that the Venezuelan NGOs are under attack. And this was the refrain that we would repeatedly hear. By attack, the embassy really meant being held accountable, or that the Venezuelan people were wise to their activities. Most political parties and NGOs that receive U.S. or Canadian funding in the name of democracy likewise refuse to be interviewed about their activities. This is to say that Eva Golinger's detailed expose helped put the lie to the rhetoric of democracy promoters who would have us believe that they are open and honest about their intentions. Eva has shown that they have a great deal to hide, and the fact that they refuse to be interviewed by us further shows that they don't want people to know what they're really doing. For it is they, the purported democracy promoters, who are attacking democracy and the Bolivarian Revolution. On that note, I would like to introduce to all of you Eva Golinger.
I'm just going to do then a little summary of Venezuela before Chavez. Very, very general, not as detailed. I'm not a historian. But the fall of the last dictatorship in Venezuela was 1958. That was Perez Jimenez. So Venezuela had dictators, very similar to other countries in Latin America throughout the last century and before, intermittent with governments that were elected. And the fall of the last one was 1958. This started the period of what was referred to as representative democracy based on a U.S. model. Two parties basically sharing the power back and forth. Structure of government very similar. Three branches, the judicial, the legislative, the executive, two-chamber Congress, things like that. The 1960s in Venezuela, the beginning of this period of representative democracy, was incredibly repressive. There's a lot of Venezuelan contemporary history that's not known around the world and is not even known by many Venezuelans today that didn't live through that period. How many of you have heard of Luis Posada Carriles? Luis Posada Carriles, born in Cuba, Cuban, who was one of the first to leave during, when the revolution happens in Cuba, goes to the U.S., is trained, first receives army training, then CIA, founds the anti-Castro terrorist movement there with the CIA in Miami, is later sent to Venezuela, where he's nationalized as a Venezuelan. So he's Cuban, but he's also Venezuelan national. And he's charged with designing Venezuela's counterintelligence division of the State Security Agency. So in the 1960s in Venezuela, just like in other countries throughout Latin America and around the world, there was a vibrant leftist, revolutionary, radical movement. Guerrillas, things like that, communists, and as in many countries, this movement was also persecuted. In the case of Venezuela, the persecution, the torture, the repression was designed and conducted and directed by Luis Posada Carriles, running this counterintelligence agency specifically to target those movements in Venezuela. So it was a time period of tremendous repression, torture, lots of torture, political prisoners, even the disappeared. In fact, the concept of the disappeared actually began in Venezuela. A lot of people don't know that there were even disappeared in Venezuela. We don't even know the numbers. They're in the thousands. And it's an area of Venezuelan memory that was actually completely repressed and is just now starting to come out again. Now, one, because of the situation happening with this individual, with Luis Posada Carriles, but also because now there's a government in place, that's seeking social justice now and for the future for its people, but that also means we have to see, the past as well and find justice for lots of things that happened in the past. So, 1960s, this is happening in Venezuela, so-called representative democracy in place, but actually more repressive than the dictatorship just before that it ended in 1958. So in 1976, oil is nationalized in Venezuela. The oil industry is nationalized in 1976. Common misconception, at least as it's reported in the press, is that Chavez nationalized the oil industry. That's not true. 1976, during the period of representative democracy, very prosperous times in Venezuela. Venezuela's always been a wealthy nation because of its oil. In the 1970s, early 1970s, Luis Posada Carriles actually leaves the State Security Agency. There's a change of government from one of the parties to the other party, between Acción Democrática and COPE. And he sets up actually a CIA-funded and equipped private security agency to continue to pursue those same activities against the Venezuelan left and to build up a movement there of other, Cubans who are in Venezuela. Venezuela was is still one of the largest concentrations, less today, but was before Chavez, one of the largest concentrations of anti-Castro Cubans next to Miami. So, because it's actually very close to all of those areas. In the 1970s, Luis Posada Carriles continues to build and work against, the Cuban Revolution from Venezuela. And in 1976, October 6th, he masterminds along with Orlando Bosch, another Cuban in Venezuela at the time, and with two Venezuelans, the bombing of the Cuban airliner that takes off from Barbados and is actually the first terrorist act blowing up an airplane in this hemisphere, killing all 73 people on board. The two Venezuelans who actually put the bombs on the plane confess and are convicted and spend almost their full terms of 20 years in prison in Venezuela. Luis Posada Carriles is arrested as well as the intellectual author, along with Orlando Bosch. He spends 9 years in prison, but during that time period, he's going through, trial and appeal and all this kind of stuff. His trial actually never ends. It's still, going through the legal process, and he escapes prison in 1985. Flees Venezuela. Before that, Orlando Bosch also, or around that time, is let go by corrupt governments at the time. He is then pardoned and given permanent residency in the United States, Orlando Bosch, by George H.W. Bush, the father of the current president of the United States. And Luis Posada Carriles continues to conduct these, terrorist activities throughout Latin America, Central America, the dirty wars in the 80s, until 1999. He's found in Panama and caught and arrested and detained for a plot to blow up a university where Fidel Castro was going to speak. He was going to kill everybody. Not in an attempt to assassinate Castro, kill also the hundreds or thousands of spectators that were going to come to see him. He's imprisoned in Panama and then pardoned by the outgoing president in 2004, where he then, a year later, appears in Miami. And he gives a press conference about how, safe and sound he finally is in Miami in, I think it's about March, April, May 2005, so about 2 years ago. Venezuela then requests his extradition, because in Venezuela there's no statute of limitations on criminal homicide or acts of terrorism. This case is left pending. He's a fugitive from justice. Venezuela wants to extradite him. The United States has refused to really respond officially to that extradition request. It's now been 2 years. And what happened was a lot of you know this, but I'm saying it anyway. He got detained on immigration charges for having entered illegally into the United States. Spent 2 years in a detention center, not a prison, because these are not criminal charges. It's actually administrative law. And given the runaround in the legal system, eventually last week the case was dismissed by the judge. All charges, administrative charges for fraud, for lying about how he entered the country. He had said in his press conference that he came via land through Mexico, but in reality, the investigators found out that he had entered on a shrimping boat into Florida. And anyway, so he was being charged with that. That was the big charge, even though he's actually authored a book that is available on the internet. I don't necessarily suggest reading it, but he authored a book about all his terrorist activities over the past 40 years. So he's a self-confessed terrorist, as well as there being sufficient documents that have been declassified in the United States that demonstrate by the CIA, FBI documents that show and talk about him as a terrorist and about his activities. So the charges are dismissed by the judge in a sentence or a ruling that actually says, her decision, that there had been prosecutorial misconduct in the investigation regarding his activities, and the judge uses the language, she writes in her opinion, says that it was a gross violation of the universal principles of justice, and therefore he is free. So this terrorist is now free in Miami, reunited with the others, and Venezuela's extradition request still hasn't been responded to. There are Venezuelans who are victims of torture by his hand and direction who are now coming forward and talking about this in Venezuela, trying to bring justice, talk about hypocrisy on the issue of terrorism by the United States. Here's a self-confessed terrorist free in Miami, and Venezuela, a country with a treaty, an extradition treaty from 1922 with the United States, has been trying to extradite him for 2 years and has received no response. Rewind back to the 1970s in Venezuela. Oil's nationalized in 76. The 1980s, again, the same, this is this time period, two political parties, literally 4 years, one party in office, another 4 years, another party in office, just switching back and forth. A political and economic elite and is concentrating power, during this time period. The rich get a lot richer, the poor get a lot poorer and grow. How many of you have been to Venezuela? People are, fair. Wow, you guys, good. Good turnout. Well, if you've been to Caracas, then Caracas, similar now that I've seen some of Vancouver, is a city in a valley. There are mountains surrounding Caracas, and those of you who have been there have seen that the poverty has grown up into the hills, into the mountains, one shack literally built on top of the other. When you see images from the last dictatorship in the 50s, 1950s, you'll see that none of those shacks were there. This is something that's grown throughout the period of representative democracy after oil was even nationalized. Oil industry being nationalized to benefit the people and the infrastructure, social programs, things like that. State money's going into, the future of the state and its people. That wasn't happening. So in the 80s, the greedy 80s, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. Poverty is growing to such an alarming rate that by the 90s, mid-90s and late 90s, it's almost up to 80% in the country. That's outrageous for such a wealthy nation. In 1988, the president who was president during the nationalization of oil in 76 is elected again. Carlos Andres Perez. He runs on a platform basically promising the people or pledging that he wasn't going to implement, at the time, the very popular International Monetary Fund neoliberal privatization package. People elect him thinking he'll bring us back to the prosperous times we had in the 70s. But exactly the opposite takes place once he wins and is sworn in as president, makes an announcement that privatization will be implemented during his presidency. He will take the path to privatization that other countries in Latin America were taking. So people react in Venezuela thinking, one, this means gas prices will go up, oil will go up, everything's going to get more expensive, there will be inflation, and business owners, distributors of different products, food and beverage, begin to hoard their products. This has been classic reaction in Venezuela and strategy also for economic collapse, is that, products are hoarded thinking, of course, if there's going to be inflation, why sell today my, sugar or whatever, when tomorrow it'll be worth double the price. So hoarding is taking place. This is the beginning of 1989. People are thinking transportation prices will go up because if gas prices go up. Gas is heavily subsidized in Venezuela. In fact, today you can fill the tank of an SUV for less than $4 US dollars, so that's pretty cheap. And the thought that this would go up would change the lifestyles of Venezuelans, if the prices would go up. So people react, they take to the streets. February 27, 1989. Basically, poor people pour into the streets, looting, rioting, protesting these measures, reacting and responding to this concept of privatization being implemented. In what some call or could be referred to as the first anti-privatization mass mobilization in the world. Caracas, February 27, 1989. The Caracazo, it's called, the big Caracas explosion. People take to the streets, looting primarily food, when you see images from that time period, you'll see people walking out of the supermarkets going, with big boxes full of food. They were starving, walking out with like these giant cuts of beef from butcher shops, taking everything they could to be able to eat, because for the weeks before, the products had been hoarded. There was nothing on the shelves, so it was a hungry people. The reaction of the government to this is not to dialogue with the people. It was to send out the armed forces and the police to massacre them, to literally open fire, shoot them, kill as many as you can. And that's what happened. Thousands. I mean, the estimate is over 3,000 people were killed that day. This is just in Caracas, in the Caracas region. In fact, the police forces went into poor neighborhoods and just shot them up. The buildings. I mean, there are images. We just commemorated the 18-year anniversary this past February 27th. And they showed a lot of documentaries around the country, around Venezuela. And the images were just, devastating and so severe to see the insides of people's apartments on a high-level floor, on a high-rise, filled with bullet holes. Because they had shot them up or shot through the doors, the armed forces, people that weren't even involved in the protests. It was just to eliminate the poor, eliminate them in an incredibly, eradicate poverty in a very perverse way. So this was one of also sort of the first mobilizations of poor people in the streets of Venezuela. And even though many were injured and killed, a sort of growing movement began to fester in the country. In 1992, Hugo Chavez, then a lieutenant colonel in the army, leads a military rebellion to overthrow the murderous and corrupt government of Carlos Andrés Pérez. And he fails. And he goes public. He's given airtime on television, and he tells his other military brothers to put their arms down. In fact, Chavez and his group of military in the army, at the time of that massacre in 1989, February 27th, they refused to participate, refused to take arms against the people. So in February 1992, February 4, they lead this military rebellion, fails, he goes to prison. He spends 2 years in prison, but he comes on the scene as this individual, took responsibility for that failure, and a lot of people supported that rebellion, and he gave hope to people that a movement could be built in the future by saying, asking his brothers to put their arms down for now. 1993, Carlos Andrés Pérez is brought up on impeachment charges for corruption. But instead of facing the charges, he flees the country. Does anyone know where he goes? Can you guess? Right, where he's probably with Luis Posada Carriles today, conspiring still against Venezuela and Cuba and other countries. So he leaves the country, never comes back. Fugitive from justice, acquires incredible wealth. I mean, he was already wealthy, but, had just embezzled. The corruption was stealing. That's what he had been doing, stealing from the nation's wealth. 1994, Chavez is pardoned by then President Rafael Caldera, and he's released from prison. Many Venezuelans, a majority, applauded that pardon and began, along with Chavez, to build a movement now not just military but also civilian, so civil-military unity, based on the ideas of the liberator of Venezuela, Simón Bolívar, ideas such as Latin American integration, sovereignty, true liberation, independence from U.S. domination now, the colonial power, social justice issues, a redistribution, obviously, of the nation's wealth, right? So all throughout the 90s also, because you mentioned the issue of repression of human rights even 12 years ago. You brought that up with somebody who came here seeking political asylum, probably was a military member that participated in this movement with Chavez, the individual who came here. I don't know who it is, requesting political asylum 12 years ago. But during the 90s in Venezuela, just like during the 60s and the 70s and even the 80s, but in the 90s when all this other stuff was going on, it was a time of also incredible repression. I mean, I lived there then in between about 93 to 98, and I remember the government coming out all the time, or there were just time periods, they would just say, constitutional rights are suspended. You have no rights. The Constitution is no longer valid. The government just declaring that. State of emergency, curfew imposed, and military draft. A military draft that Venezuela had up until Chavez eradicated it, eliminated the military draft. But it was a way, military draft in a country with no enemy. no, no military enemy, ridiculous. It was just a way of controlling the population and repression, keeping repression on. And imagine having, all your rights just suspended. Not like what's happening in the United States with the slow, suspension of human rights and well, they don't even have human rights, but any rights, constitutional rights through the Patriot Act. But literally a government just coming out and saying, no more rights. So this was frequent in Venezuela.